Hi kids, it's Mrs. Fravel. How are you? Good. Or I'm sorry. I'm fine, thanks. Hey, we are going to start talking about the next level of ecology in this unit. Unit 3 is about population ecology and how populations change and what can influence a population's rise and downfall, really. This unit's going to culminate in you predicting the human population and looking at how the human population might change over the next little while. Okay, so keep all of that in mind as we're doing this. You're not going to be doing a CER. Instead, you're going to be making a graph model of the human population and predicting it in the future. You should have already watched David Attenborough's video in the Encounter module launch video. So now I'm just going to go through and define some things for you, and that word define is important. You should be taking notes from this presentation. You should have a piece of paper out and you should be writing things down because I'm going to want to see those in your final human population predictions and explanations. And also you have a vocabulary assignment that was associated with that encounter. So you might want to pay attention and also have the vocab out because I'm going to be defining probably most of your vocabulary words in this presentation. So without further ado, let's talk about how populations change in response to their environment or limiting factors. All right, quick review. What are we studying? We're studying ecology. Ecology is the study of all the abiotic and biotic factors in an environment and how they interact. And remember, living things are affected by their environment, but the environment's also affected by living things, and then changes in that environment can change the living things, right? It's a big wheel, it's a big cycle. You saw that when we talked about the wolves of Yellowstone, right? And how wolves change rivers, and then how the rivers affect the whole ecosystem, right? Okay. So within an ecosystem, we have populations. We're going to talk about populations today and next week. Populations is a population is all of the individuals of a species living together in the same area. Community is all of the populations of organisms that interact in an ecosystem. The habitat is the physical place where an organism lives. So we kind of talk about habitats in terms of the same terms of biome, right? So there might be forest habitats, desert habitats, ocean habitats, freshwater habitats, okay? Ecological niche, that is the job that an organism does in its environment. So it's all of the resources, both biotic and abiotic, that an organism and populations use for survival, growth, and reproduction, okay? All right. So let's talk about how populations are structured and how they change. Population density, and P.S. I've underlined vocabulary words in this, okay? So density just is defined as how many of a given species are in an area. How many birds are there? How many falcons in particular are there? How many bison are there in this particular area? Okay? And this is calculated as a number of organisms per unit area, whatever that unit is. It might be meters if we're talking about plants that are, when we get into the lower trophic levels, when we have this huge biomass of plant producers, right, there's going to be a lot of them. So we're going to probably have a pretty small defined area for their population definition. Their density definition might be a square meter, okay? But when we get up into the higher trophic levels and we have fewer organisms due to that trophic exchange of energy, you remember that from the last unit, we're going to maybe have to start talking about bigger areas. We're going to talk about square kilometers or tens of kilometers. And generally how wildlife biologists take a census, or they count or they estimate how many of a population live in an area, is they will define their area. So let's say a whole biome, or a whole habitat, like a forest. And if they want to know how many individuals of a species are in that area, it's really probably not practical for one person or one team of researchers to walk around the entire biome and count every single one of the species in that area. So what they do is they will make a grid on a map of their habitat that they're studying, and that grid might be defined by like kilometers or meters, and they will pick randomly a square in their grid, so 1 square kilometer or 1 square meter, and they will just go to that particular square and they will physically count how many of an organism they observe there in a given time. Okay, so it's math and it's estimating. Okay, so and they also have to be careful about the grid that they choose, because sometimes you'll get kind of coagulations or clumps of a specific organism in a specific place at a given time, but then they might, and that might not represent the distribution of them throughout their whole range. So for instance, when we look at this picture, I've got this Cape buffalo, and he's surrounded by cattle egrets. Those are the birds. So cattle egrets like to hang out around big hoofed animals. 1, for protection from predators. 2, they eat insects. And as these big animals move and walk around and go into the water, they stir up insects, and the egrets then have this food source. So we tend to see them kind of clustered around these buffalo. So if we just went to this buffalo in our grid and counted all of the egrets, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 egrets within this square meter. It probably isn't accurate to take those 9 egrets times the total number of meters in your area, because there's not buffalo every meter. Okay, so it's an estimate, but they are smart about where they take a count in order to make sure that it's accurate. Okay, then we visualize density in this way, again, with the lower trophic levels like plants. We're going to talk about it in a per square meter type situation. When it comes to things like the primary consumers, we might talk about them in a square kilometer, and in predators, we might talk about them in more of 100 square kilometers or 200 square kilometers, because they're going to have to forage, or they're going to have to travel longer distances to find enough energy, right? Biomass increases as you go down the trophic levels. It decreases as you go up. All right. Oh, there's math, you guys. Oof, there's always math in science. Oh, even in biology. Okay. So to find an organism's population density, first you have to define the area that you are looking at. It might be a state. Again, it might be a certain forest or a certain desert or something. And then you will go to count the animals in your grid, and you multiply that number by the total area, right? So then you get their total population. To get their density, like how many are in a per square meter, we're going to take the number of individuals that we've counted and divide it by the area that they live in. So for example, here in Utah, we have deer, white-tailed deer, and we have 372,500 deer approximately in Utah. Okay, that was based on a count done from a grid. Utah, as a state, covers an area of 219,890 square kilometers. So what's the population density of deer in Utah? To figure that, we're going to take the population of deer, 372,500, divided by the square kilometers of Utah, 219,890 square kilometers, divide, okay, number of individuals divided by total area we're looking at, and we should get 1.69 deer per square kilometer in Utah. That doesn't sound bad, right? But when I look out my window, do I see a deer and a half every square kilometer? Not really, right? Because there are different ways that populations distribute themselves spatially. Okay, so again, distribution is the pattern of spacing of a population within an area, and they do that in three different ways. There can be uniform dispersion, where you see them at pretty regular intervals. Okay, in the deer example, if deer had a uniform distribution, we would have 1.5 deer living in every square kilometer. When you go to the next square kilometer, there's another deer and a half. I don't want to know what half of a deer looks like. So that mostly happens mostly in plants, okay? And then we have random dispersion, where they just might pop up anywhere. And then we also have clumped dispersion, where these organisms hang out in groups, plants and animals both, okay? Clumping is the most common way that we find populations distributed. There we go. Because there is safety in numbers when we're talking about animals. There's safety in numbers. They can have social interactions. It's easier to find mates. And also, we tend to find their food resources clumped as well, okay? And their water resources. Uniform is not very common. It's usually in areas where there are scarce resources. And the resources are really what this is all based on. Where is the food? Where is the nutrients? Where are the mates? Where is the space? How do we avoid predators? That's how population distribution is kind of determined, okay? Okay, so where do we find organisms? We find them in their range. And range is the specific part of the world or the specific part of their biome that an organism inhabits, okay? And sometimes when you look at maps, if you look at the range of an organism, you'll see maps like this where the shaded areas are where we find them, okay? And this varies depending on what organism we're talking about. Some organisms have a very narrow range. We only find them in small pockets. Others are found much more widely, spread across a continent, spread across the world, okay? And the range is really determined by the abiotic factors that change across the area of the planet. So usually a species, they have a pretty narrow range of abiotic tolerances that they can live in, right? They have a certain kind of food, they have a certain temperature boundary, a certain amount of water, things like that, okay? So once you start traveling outside of a certain range, those abiotic factors change, and some species just can't adapt to that. So they might have a narrower range. But we have both. We have animals with narrow ranges and with wide ranges. So this over here is an example of a narrow range organism. This is an iwi. Yeah, it's a Hawaiian honeycreeper bird. Look how cute they are, you guys. They are only found in the Hawaiian Islands. That's it. That's the only place they are, okay? And on the opposite side of that, we have the peregrine falcon. They are found all over the world, one species. These guys can fly massive distances. They're on all the continents except for Antarctica, and they are actually here in Utah. We might have some on Corner Canyon campus. So these guys have a very wide range. They're very successful, very adaptable. They can eat anything that they find, whereas these little narrower birds, they're limited to what kind of food they can eat. That's keeping them in just those islands. And also those islands are very, very isolated out in the ocean as well, okay? Okay, so Fravel, what are resources? You're throwing these words out, okay. Limited resources are specific resources that are needed to survive, and they are not in unlimited quantities. I think we talked about this a little bit in the last unit, so hopefully this is review. So these can affect how a population grows and how large a population of organisms can get. And limited resources include water, food, space, mates. Okay. Oh, whoops, sorry, didn't mean to extra click there. So limited resources are these things that an organism and a population of organisms need in order to survive, and do not come in unlimited quantities. And they have to compete with each other, and they may have to compete with other species in order to get to these limited resources. Okay. The other thing that can limit populations are called limiting factors. So limited resources, I'm sorry, I will go back. Whew. Getting toward the end of the day, kids. Fravel's brain is starting to check out. I'm back. Okay, here we go. Limited resources, the water, food, space, and mate, there's a limited amount of them available. Okay? And what happens is the amount of those available can also limit the size of a population of organisms. It can put a cap on how many there are in a specific area, and it can also influence the rate at which a population grows, which I'm also going to talk about in a minute. Okay? So limited resources. Limited means there's only so much of them, and they also limit populations. They are included in a longer list of limiting factors. So limiting factors limit the size of a population. Okay? Populations really can't just keep increasing indefinitely, and that ties back to our abiotic-biotic interactions. So when we talked about the wolves of Yellowstone, think about what the elk were doing when they had no predators, when the wolves were eradicated by humans from the park. The elk population was out of control, right? What happened to the resources, those willow bushes on the river? What happened to them, and how did that affect the other organisms that ate those plants as well? What happened to the river? Okay. So there are these factors that keep a population from continuing to increase indefinitely. They just can't, or they become a burden on the environment. That includes two different types of limiting factors. You need to know these. Make sure you write them down in your notes and in your vocabulary. Okay, so we have density dependent limiting factors, and those come down to they will only start to affect a population when a population gets to a certain size. So it depends on how many of the individuals you have in your population. This is stuff like competition, competing with each other for food, water, space, or mates, or competing with another species for those things. Okay? Competition increases the more that you get, and somebody wins and somebody loses, right? Predation as well. The more you have the more prey animals you have in a population, the more opportunities that predators have to hunt them, and the more predators you're going to have. Okay, and then parasitism and disease. Disease and parasites spread like crazy through a dense population. We're kind of seeing that right now in our own human population with the pandemic. Okay? When we have a large dense population, disease spreads more quickly, okay? And then overcrowding, same thing. That will start to physically limit the size of a population in an area. So those are density-dependent limiting factors. They control the size of a population based on the size of the population. But then we have density-independent limiting factors. These are things that affect the size or the growth rate of a population, and it doesn't matter how many in that population there are, because it's stuff like abiotic factors changing, the weather, the temperature, the climate, things like that. Doesn't matter how many sharks are in the ocean. If the ocean changes temperature to 90 degrees, all of those sharks are going to boil, right? Natural disasters as well, those will take out whoever's in the way of that hurricane is going to get taken out. Let's go back to the sharks. Sharks are affected by hurricanes, especially if they are shallow water sharks, because of storm surge, changes in salinity in the water. Hurricanes really mess up shallow water ecosystems, okay? And then human interference. We don't care how many they are. We're going to build our buildings anyway. We're going to pollute anyway. We're going to do what we do either intentionally or accidentally that can affect populations of other organisms in an area, and it doesn't matter how many of them are there, they're going to be affected, their population size. Okay? So make sure you know the difference between density-dependent and density-independent limiting factors, including limited resources. So many L words, so many limits. Okay. So how do populations grow, and how fast do they grow? The population growth rate, or PGR, explains how fast a population grows, and it depends on the population, where they are, their limiting resources, or limited resources and limiting factors. Some populations stay very stable. We don't see changes in them. There's a good equilibrium between some population and their environment and their competitors. We see other populations that their growth rate varies year to year, just depending on the conditions within the habitat. Okay? And this depends on both, and we see this shown as both logistical and exponential growth. And that is something that you are going to be learning about and looking at in your assignment for today. Okay? It also depends on how many are coming and going in a population. We call that the following: natality, or birth rate. Those mean the same thing. It's how many are born within a certain time frame, whether that's a decade, a year, one reproductive cycle, which some organisms might have more than one offspring cycle per year. Like rabbits can have like 2 to 3 litters a year. But then there are other animals like pandas, or is it pandas? That only reproduce every 4 to 5 years, right? Okay, so that's their birth rate. Mortality and death rate, how many die? And emigration with an E, like Emigration Canyon up by where I live, is the number of individuals that leave a population for whatever reason. They just keep walking. I'm out of here. I'm gonna go found my own population. Okay? Emigration, E is away. And then we have immigration, I is in. So immigration is the number of individuals that might come into a population from outside. So for instance, in lion prides, if a male dies, new males immigrate in to take over the pride. Okay, oof, more math. Guys, Fravel's not a math person, but science is math. This one's not too hard. The population growth rate percentage, math is easy. It's birth rate minus death rate plus migration rate. That's it. A migration rate is the difference between emigration and immigration. How many change due to migration. And that's a whole other level, so we're not going to make you figure that out. And we talk about it in birth rate per thousand, death rate per thousand, migration rate per thousand individuals in a population. So for example, if we have an organism that has a birth rate of 12 per 1,000, that means that over a reproductive cycle, 12 babies are born for every 1,000 individuals in the population. Okay. Death rate is 8.8 per thousand, and migration rate is 2.5 per 1,000. So how do we figure out their growth, the percentage of growth? You take 12 minus 8.8 plus 2.5. Whoops, I get ahead on my clickies sometimes. And we get a growth rate of 5.7%. Okay? Make sure you wrote that down. Pause me at any time. There's a discussion question where you have to do this math, so make sure you get that as well, okay? Okay. So how do organisms reproduce? There are two major strategies for reproduction, and a strategy is just how many babies do you have at one time? That's essentially what a reproductive pattern is. There are two. There are R strategists, and these are organisms that reproduce based on the availability of fluctuating limited resources. That is a lot of big words. That means food. So like here in the Northern Hemisphere, where we have pretty wide temperature and pretty wide temperature and light swings. So during the winter, the plants go dormant, ground is covered with snow. you're not going to, that's a highly fluctuating environment, okay? Our strategists are organisms that are going to only reproduce when the resources are there for their offspring and for themselves to have the energy needed to reproduce, because it takes a lot of energy to reproduce. These are usually small organisms, and they, boom, they have as many babies as you can have. Just keep having babies during that boom cycle of the environment. Okay, if there's food, have babies. If it's warm, have more babies. If there's still longer fall, have more babies. And you grow up fast, you have a short lifespan. And there's usually, with some of them, there's not a lot of parental care either. Okay, so these are things like insects, rodents, and plants that disperse seeds. They grow 100 flowers, and all those flowers release seeds, and then they do it again. Okay? And then, these guys are not, these populations generally are a little more fragile. They never reach their carrying capacity. They might all die off in the cold season, and they've just left their eggs out to hopefully hatch in the next year. These guys are more influenced by density independent factors like the weather and human influence, things like that, okay? And then the other strategy is K strategists. So K strategists are the ones that either live in more stable environments, or they are better able to tolerate changes in their environment, and they just don't reproduce during those times, but they weather them just fine. They live in more stable environments or are better, more adaptable. Wow, here we go. Fravel's fine. These are generally larger organisms with longer lifespans. So think of any big animal, right? Elephants, humans, we are K strategists. Dogs generally, and then also some larger trees. Most plants are R strategists, but larger trees might not send off as many shoots that grow into new trees, things like that, or drop as many seeds. These guys, their populations generally do reach carrying capacity, and we did talk about carrying capacity in the last unit. I'm going to cover it again in a minute. And these have fewer offspring. Instead of releasing 100 eggs as an insect, there are birds that will have 2 eggs per year. They will nest, they will have 2 eggs, they will raise those babies, and they're done for that cycle. Okay? Or as humans, we are able physiologically to reproduce once a year. Yeah. Okay, so let's review carrying capacity. This is the maximum number of individuals that any habitat can support, and we talk about it by population. So some species in one habitat will have a different carrying capacity than other species in that same habitat, and it just depends on what resources they use, what limited resources they need to survive, and also their reproductive strategy. Okay, so carrying capacity, generally we can graph over time, and by time we mean multiple years. This isn't 1 year's change for most, it's over years. Okay? And it depends on the amount of limited resources available. The size of the population will influence how it fluctuates, and it's that fluctuation that helps us determine the carrying capacity. Okay? It also is influenced by the amount of resources each individual consumes, and David Attenborough talked about that in his video. We consume a lot as Americans, each of us as an individual. We consume a lot of resources. You use a lot of water because you probably shower every day, right? You consume a lot of food, and maybe you throw some of it away. NBD, it's just food and I didn't like it, so you throw it away. We drive a lot, we use a lot of paper, we buy a lot of clothes. All of those things consume limited resources. And as Americans, we just think that that's fine. This is what we do, right? In other countries, that isn't done. They just don't live that way. So each individual consumes fewer resources, less water, less of all of those resources, okay? So that can influence the carrying capacity. Okay. As a population becomes more crowded, so when we talk about time, we talk about kind of assuming that this is a new population, maybe if it split off of an old population, if a couple of individuals emigrated off of the original population to start their own, we'll start looking at their growth rate. And as they become more and more crowded, the population size will reach a pinnacle. And then this slope right here is an exponential slope that represents the birth rate, and the immigration rate is higher than the death rate and the emigration rate. So we get this exponential growth, but at some point it has to stop growing. The environment simply can't support anymore. So then we get this downward curve in the number of individuals in a population, and that is where the death rate and the emigration rate are higher than the birth rate and immigration rate. And as the environment starts to recover, as the limited resources start to recover because there are fewer individuals using them, we start to see that birth rate go up again, and we get more individuals surviving, and then we get that swing down again as they have overstripped their environment. And that continues forever throughout time. The carrying capacity, oh, I could have been showing you more of that. Okay. So we get this cycle of birth and use, and then death and rebound of the environment. Okay, the carrying capacity is kind of the average number within those peaks. So ecologists like to get a couple of years or a couple of cycles of this birth and death cycling, and then they'll take an average number, and you can eyeball it just right through the middle of those curves. Okay, that's the carrying capacity. Okay, whew. I'm done. Okay, thank you for your patience. You guys have been wonderful. Do you have any questions? Okay, what's your assignment? Great question. Your assignment is, of course, on Canvas. I've linked it below this video. It also has its own page. You need to do the Lion Populations Virtual Lab. There are instructions on the assignment page for doing it. I'm only going to say this one more time. Make sure you're reading all of the things, okay? And then there's a populations assessment worksheet that you should also do. That's going to take you back to the wolves of Yellowstone, and you're going to apply what you learned in the lion lab to the wolf populations, okay? You guys, I told you I like these stupid dogs. I love the Yellowstone wolves. They're great. They're really fun to watch. And they do amazing things in their ecosystem. We don't give predators enough credit, and we don't do enough for them. So I like to see them there. Okay, so those are your assignments. They are due this Friday. Today, hopefully you're watching this on Monday, October 19th. This is due Friday the 23rd. You should really have it done by Wednesday because you'll have other assignments, okay? Okay, that's it for me. Have a great week. Have a great weekend. Be good. Wear your masks and be kind, okay? Okay.